I think for the amount of time Blade has been out, I think it's fair enough to kind of give an opinion on whether I think he's strong or weak or just kind of mediocre. Now, I will say, I do think he's really cool. He's probably one of my favorite DPS that they've added to the game. I like his gameplay loop. I like all his abilities. I think it's really cool. I like his aesthetic. However, I think he's pretty weak. And so do quite a bit of people, honestly. And I'm going to be saying why I think so, and maybe some buffs that they could add to Blade. Like I said in the beginning, I think his gameplay loop is pretty fun. I like the idea of switching from a melee character to more or less like a ranged hit scan type of character. But I think that's where the first problem lies, and it's his shotgun. I feel like his shotgun compared to his sword is way stronger than it needs to be. And now I'm not saying they should nerf the shotgun, because if they did, I think this character would literally be unplayable, because his shotgun at a certain range is really good for, you know, getting kills and just doing good damage if you're at the right range. And I think his shotgun being really good actually does help him overall, because like I said, if it was really bad, I think he would just literally be unplayable. So I am kind of glad the shotgun is pretty good. But when you compare it to the sword, his base sword anyways, his sword does almost little to nothing damage. That at that point, why would you even swap to it when you have your shotgun right there? Because even if you're not at the optimal range, it still feels like you're doing more with your shotgun compared to your sword. And I think that's the first thing they could address, is whether or not they want to either match the level of like the power of both the shotgun and sword, or just overall give the sword a big buff. And I'm going to be talking about that after this. But I just think the shotgun, you know, like the character's name is Blade, and for 90% of the time you're using a shotgun. And I think, you know, if they give more power to the sword, the Blade, I think it'd be pretty good for him in the neutral. Because a lot of the times when you want to pull out your sword, you know, it is part of his loop of when you want to go in for the brawl and you want to do like a lot of chaos. Because I will say, when you do have a sword, he does get a lot of ult charge if you're able to stay alive. But I just think, for one, when you pull out your sword, you are pretty vulnerable, and you have to basically, you know, just run around, feed, take a lot of damage, because that's how you have to really play it when you're on that, you know, ability with the sword, is just kind of being there, BMS, which I think is fine. I think it's very fun, actually. I think that's one of the best part about this kit, is when you pull out the sword, you do feel like you're really in there, you're causing a lot of mess. But when you just look at the damage, it just feels like you're doing nothing. And you compare it to the shotgun, it's just like, wow, why did I just switch in the first place? I just should just stick to the shotgun. So I think if they add one buff to his sword, whether it be the base damage or just increase how much you get, because as you know, with Blade, you kind of have to get all 10 stacks to do the maximum damage. And sometimes it feels like you're not really doing enough with your sword compared to a shotgun. Now, I do kind of understand where they were coming from. Maybe they kind of wanted to just test the waters first, because, you know, if they released a broken, you know, brawl melee character on launch, I feel like it would cause a lot of problems in the community, and maybe the casual players might not like, and people who are like high level, it'd just be banned permanently. So I can kind of understand why they wouldn't want to make him overpowered off the bat. I mean, the trailers really did make him look super scary, but as you know, he was released, he turned out to be kind of meh. But I just think that's one of the things they could focus on, is the sword being equal power to the shotgun, and not have you solely rely on the shotgun as just your main damage dealer. Now, like I said before, I would like for the sword to be equal, but there's also one thing I also want to mention. With the sword, not when you swap, but when you activate the Bloodline Awakening, I think it's called, the one where you're all glowing and you get the lifesteal and then you build the stacks. Honestly, it feels like you don't do enough. Well, I wouldn't say you do enough, because that was the first part, but it doesn't feel like you get a lot of lifesteal. Now, it might look like you are, because I will say the amount of ult charge you get when you get into that ability and you start like slashing the enemy team, it is a lot. You know, it is a lot. I think he's one of the few DPS who can get their ult significantly like quicker than the rest, besides like, I don't know, Squirgo maybe, but then again, you're just kind of shooting it down. But a character who's putting himself at risk to get ult that fast, I think it's really like cool. But I think with his sword, his main thing is lifesteal, right? And in order to get value on the sword is you have to brawl. You have to put yourself in the condition of you're being out in the open. It is a risk, you know, you put yourself out in the open to take damage and just be hit a lot about like spam or the tanks or any like support or whatever, right? I understand that, but this kind of goes back to the first point of the shotgun being better. When you're in that state, it just feels like you're just kind of hoping that the enemy team doesn't shoot you, because the lifesteal that he's supposed to get doesn't really feel as much. And also for the fact that you get reduced healing when you're in that state, you know, to compensate for, you know, the lifesteal that you're getting. So obviously they would have to balance out with, yeah, you would get reduced healing from it. So either A, I think one route they could take would probably be either A, reduce the amount of, you know, healing you don't take. So if it's like, I don't know what the exact percentage it's at. I think it's 33%. I'm not sure how much healing you know, take when you're in his Bloodline Awakening state compared to normal. I think it's 33%. If not, I'll just correct myself. But I feel like either A, increase the lifesteal that he gets, or B, just decrease the amount he doesn't take. I don't know if I worded that right, but basically just allow him to receive more healing compared to what he gets normally. And I think he would feel a lot less like squishy, because I'm pretty sure we've all seen that the Blade players that insta-lock and then they do really bad. And, you know, one could possibly say like, you know, it's probably just because they're bad, which I'm not denying. But I also do think that if someone who's pretty competent at him, you know, is playing all the right cards, you know, he's managing his cooldowns, properly positioning, and in theory, if he plays well, he should get rewarded for using his abilities and trying to, you know, make a play, right? So I don't think it's fair if, you know, the 1 in 5 good players that are actually doing good on him have to get punished because the character is just garbage. He's like Iron Fist now, basically, because they both are pretty bad. And I think that could be one of the other things I buff about him. And I'm not saying to make him easier. I think his gameplay loop should stay what it is. I do like him switching through his shotgun and his sword. I think they need to keep that. I just think his sword needs to be the primary thing that they look at about his kit. Now, his ult, I personally think that might be one of the stronger parts about his kit. I don't necessarily think they should buff it. I think when you use it correctly, when you combo it with your team, it's pretty good. You know, the healing mitigation it applies to the enemy is pretty nice. I think they should keep that. I don't think they need to reduce the amount of ult charge you get or increase it. I mean, you could probably increase the ult charge, because if assuming they are going to buff him, I think it's only fair, you know, because if you add all this stuff, you have to kind of make sure he's somewhat balanced, because if you add all this stuff and then don't really try to tweak him a little bit, he could become like just way overpowered. But I think his ult should stay the same. I am a big fan of his ult. I think aesthetically he's really cool. I like how the song plays. I actually do like how it's not really an ult you can 1v6 with, but it's more encouraged that you use it with your tank that can stun, like Groot or Strange or Thing or Emma, one of those tanks. You know, I do like the synergy. It's really nice. And I think they should just leave it how it is. If they were to buff him, like I said, they could probably just increase the amount of ult charge it takes to get. So it's like a little more fair, so you don't get it instantly, because he already gets his ult insanely fast, to the point where it's like you can use it once and then you just use your sword and just get it instantly. And I think, you know, that's one of his strong points. And I think that wouldn't be too much to ask for if they just, you know, if they do buff everything else, just could reduce the ult charge to like compensate so he doesn't seem overpowered. And yeah, I think that's a good way to kind of balance him out more or less. And I'm pretty sure they might, because a lot of people do play him. Because, you know, he is a fun character. I think him being as difficult as he's a 3-star difficulty, but it just feel like he has like a niche to him, you know, because he has so many abilities that I think that's part of his charm. You know, if you learn his kit, you should be rewarded because he has so much, and knowing when to use your shotgun and your sword is how you get value on him. And I think him being difficult is like the best part about him. And I think they should just kind of keep the loop the same, but have a fine tweak on his sword, because I just think that's the main problem he has. His sword is just so much weaker than his shotgun, it seems. Now, for the last thing I want to talk about Blade, I'm not sure if they should buff the Cloak and Dagger team up. I don't think they should. You know, there's already so much healing in this game that I feel like if they just buff that, we're going to have way more sustain than we already have. I don't think that team up needs to be buffed or looked at. I think it's sword, healing mitigation is the one thing that they could look at, because it does feel like you are squishy. Because in the early access, I don't know if many of you noticed, he did have 375 HP before they toned it down to 350. And the devs have said that, I don't know the exact quote, but there's a quote that the dev said about his lifesteal being like 60%, but with the healing reduction, it's like decreased, obviously. I'm gonna put that on screen, but I think if, you know, they were to buff him, the sword, the healing mitigation, I guess you could say maybe his cooldowns maybe could get a little looked at. I think his block seems fine. I do like the parry. It doesn't feel bad. You know, if you use it correctly, it has a pretty fair cooldown. I think it's like 3 seconds. I don't know, but it is pretty short. I think that's one of the I don't see a lot of Blade players use it, but I feel like it's one of the most underrated parts of his kit. His block is actually pretty good, and the fact you get your dash back, I think they can just leave the block where it is. I think it's fine, but I just think the sword, they gotta do something about that, because if not, I feel we're just gonna have, you know, Iron Fist 2 essentially. But yeah, I think overall, I think he's very fun. I think he's cool. His aesthetic is nice. I like how there's a lot of attention to detail to him. I kind of understand why they wouldn't want to make him overpowered, or maybe they were trying to figure out what to do with him, honestly, because, you know, it's not easy. But I do think now that he's been out for a little bit, I think it's fair to say that maybe his sword is the one thing they could buff, so he's more like strong and not really weak, because, you know, he's a DPS character. And, you know, I think as a DPS character, if your character can't do damage, you might as well just swap, you know. But I do think they should look at that. Now, I don't think he's a throw pick. I think he's on the weaker side, definitely. But I feel like with a few tweaks, he could be increased, like in strength wise. And yeah, that's what I think. Let me know if you agree, disagree. Let me know if you want him to be nerfed to the ground, if you think he's overpowered. And yep.